Night is the hour when museums learn to whisper. Under the National Mall, a web of climate and quiet breathes through walls that remember the touch of sunlight and the dust of ancient winds. You can stand before the doors of a gallery and feel the day's footsteps cooling, the stories settling in their cases like birds on a dark branch. Yet the truest silence is kept farther away, beyond the glossy halls and map-folded gift shops, in rooms with no labels and corridors named only by numbers and locks. Some say there is a ledger there, not of marble or ink, but of rumor and want, an unwritten index people call the 65. Not a true catalog, not entirely false, but an inventory of things that may exist, or once existed, or should exist based on the edges they press into the stories left behind. Bones and copper, stones and symbols, jars and fragile bark that holds a song. Artifacts admitted and artifacts denied. Things too sacred to show, and things too troublesome to explain. The Smithsonian denies secret vaults and suppressed histories. What they keep, they claim, they keep for care, for research, for the slow work of truth. And yet the whispers remain. Bowed but unbroken. Whispers of forbidden relics and the shapes they make in the dark. Listen closely. In these shadows, 65 objects flicker like distant campfires, lighting faces we are not sure are ours. Main site or subject description. If the Smithsonian is a city, then its courtyards are the famous galleries on the Mall, the Castle, the National Museum of Natural History, the National Museum of American History, Air and Space, a republic of glass and sound. But the city has suburbs the public seldom sees. Follow the Beltway southeast to Suitland, Maryland, and you'll find the Museum Support Center, a cluster of climate-controlled pods, silver-white and windowless, where tens of millions of objects sleep in quiet alignment. Drawers that slide like whispers, jars of fish that look like stars suspended in amber rain, textiles wrapped in darkness to protect them from the knife of light. Nearby stands the Cultural Resources Center of the National Museum of the American Indian, where sacred things are held with permission and prayer, where access is not about curiosity but about kinship and rights. This is not a secret. It is how museums live. Less than 1% of their holdings can be displayed at any one time. The rest exists in a season that never ends: conservation, cataloging, consultation, relocation, study. Sometimes, the most honest place for an object is the quiet. Sometimes, you do not show a thing because it is powerful in ways that colonial glass cannot hold. But the rumor ledger persists, stitched together from newspaper clippings of the 19th century, field notes that survived a fire, stories told by watchmen walking the castle halls when James Smithson's ghost is said to rattle the keys. It is a litany of the strange, the uncomfortable, the beautiful, and the sacred. Not all are Smithsonian holdings. Some are misremembered, misattributed, or repatriated. Some never existed at all. But truth and rumor share a border, and on foggy nights, the fence disappears. People call them the 65. They might not be a list at all, only the number our minds use to count the shadows. But if you could open that ledger of whispers, it might read like this. The Ledger of 65. Giants and bones, broken measurements in the dark. A long-limbed skeleton lifted from a mound by the Ohio River, newspaper clipped as unusually tall, catalogued without fanfare, and then, in all likelihood, repatriated and reburied, a bone bridge between rumor and law. The skull from a Tennessee burial said to show double rows of teeth, more likely an illusion of worn alveoli, living on now in a fragile photograph and an exhibit of human error. Ribs and vertebrae from a Wisconsin mound reported as belonging to a giant, later inventoried as simply tall, pushing at the edges of normal, but never beyond the species boundary. A femur from West Virginia, heavy in the hand, mismeasured by enthusiasm, revisited by calm rulers and cooler eyes. A burial bundle from the Ohio Hopewell, cranial vault flattened by cradleboard, mistaken for otherworldly elongation, the truth already present in the curve of a mother's care. A jawbone that seemed too wide for a human face, until disease was named and scale was restored, evidence of life, not legend. Rotted ligatures and desiccated muscle from a Kentucky salt cave, a dry body once displayed as curiosity, now a case study in ethics and the long road to repatriation. Fragments labeled "Provisional Giant," reviewed decades later by an osteologist who wrote simply, "Male, tall, pathologies noted, no anomaly." A stack of bone tags with numbers but no names, salvaged after the 1865 Castle Fire, the living burned out of the paper, the measurements spared, the context gone. A ledger entry for "skull with unusual brow ridges," filed beneath a stack of letters arguing if ancient Americans could be ancient enough. A thoracic cage from a Missouri mound collapsed by the weight of the shovel before the weight of the years, more damage done by us than by time. A burial record from Nebraska speaking of exceptional stature, the bones long returned to earth, the claim lingering like the echo of an unmeasured room. An adolescent skeleton from Indiana misread as enormous because it lay stretched on a slope, a cautionary tale bound up in a photograph no longer in circulation. A pelvis from a Minnesota mound that spurred 2 generations of speculation and 1 quiet report correcting the map. The rumor of an entire burial, with armor, which proved to be a breastplate of shell beads and copper plates, no less astonishing for being human and true. A collection of skulls once lined in a cabinet by color and creed, a relic not of giants but of pseudoscience, dismantled and reassessed with the language of the living. A medicine bundle containing a small carved skull of stone, symbolic and sacred, never to be displayed, its power acknowledged by absence. A set of plaster casts made from bones that no longer exist, copies of lost fragments, replicas now more real than the vanished source. Inscribed stones, tablets, and maps that rewrite room boundaries. The Bat Creek Stone, unearthed in Tennessee, once identified by the Smithsonian's own as Cherokee, later claimed by enthusiasts to read Paleo-Hebrew. Today, most scholars call it a 19th century fraud, but the stone itself exists, quiet in a drawer, louder in debate. The Grave Creek Tablet, from West Virginia's mound, a slate inscribed with unclear letters, its authenticity doubted since the 19th century, yet its story still a lesson on how desire writes alphabets. The Davenport Tablets, mysterious glyphs surfacing in Iowa, revealed as planted hoaxes, but even hoaxes leave footprints in archives and minds. A rubbing of the Los Lunas Stone's 10 Commandments inscription, no proven Smithsonian origin, only the shadow of a copy filed among correspondence on American epigraphy. A folder of photographs of the Michigan Relics, fantastic tablets and idols carved by modern hands, kept as historical evidence that even well-meaning eyes can be deceived. A scratched slate once claimed to show mammoths alongside men, later attributed to an artist's hand, its lesson conserved as carefully as the artifact. A surveyor's field map of a vanished mound group, drawn with care, the earthworks now paved and parceled, their only survival the ink's resolve. An early proof plate from Ancient Monuments of the Mississippi Valley, by Squire and Davis, Smithsonian published, brimming with precise lines of circles and squares that once rose out of the grass like thoughts made geography. A scholar's notebook with sketches of characters he believed to be Old World, later identified as stylized versions of local iconography, 2 languages layered and then peeled apart. Copper, mica, stone, sky welded to earth. A Hopewell copper breastplate hammered as thin as a breath, its surface bright as a pond at noon, its provenance, sacred earth, its future, consultation. The Rogan copper plates from Georgia, dancing warriors in sheet metal, true relics of the southeastern ceremonial complex, both myth and metallurgy in one. Mica hand and eye cutouts from Ohio, glimmering signals once set in the dark of council houses, stored now in darkness, still sending light. A cache of obsidian blades found far from volcanoes, trade made tangible, a map in glass. A bundle of galena and red ochre, mineral pigments that painted the bodies of the living and the faces of the dead, pigments still staining their storage paper like memory. A set of long-nosed god effigies in copper, their noses curved like questions, their meaning layered with ceremony and diplomacy. A shell gorget incised with a weeping eye, tears flowing into spirals, cosmology carved into the curve of a sea. An effigy pipe in stone shaped as an owl, night knowledge made tool, smoke once moving through the beak the way stories move through time. A mound's cache of unbroken blades, too sharp to have ever cut meat, likely made for ceremony, still keen with their original intent. An enormous axe blade from the old copper culture, work hardened to a surprising resilience, metal's memory of hands. A hammered copper headdress crest, delicate as a leaf skeleton, that once caught the sun like a crown's dawn. A stingray spine carved in stone, thousands of miles from any sea, a ritual item carried inland by footsteps and hope. A grooved sandstone platter used to grind pigments, a painter's studio from 1,000 years ago, sleeping now behind glass that sees no audience. A mica mirror that no longer reflects, kept in the dark so that someday it might again take an image and hold it gently. An engraved stone palette whose edges are worn smooth by fingers that knew the names of colors we have not spoken in centuries. Caves, canyons, and rooms the desert forgot to lock. A photograph of the Lovelock cave excavations in Nevada, bat guano piled like dunes, split reeds, sandals, and bones, some called the tall dead, red-haired giants, most called them people. The truth lives in museum tags and tribal traditions. A specimen jar labeled Lovelock duck decoy, feathered, masterfully crafted, an everyday miracle. Notes from a Grand Canyon adventure published in 1909 about Egyptian chambers and Smithsonian men, no record in institutional files, a ghost story of the American West that shows up anyway at every campfire. A basketry fragment from a dry cave in Utah, so tightly woven it still holds dust like a breath caught mid-sentence. A pair of sandals from a New Mexico grotto, braided with wisdom, still shaped like the absent feet. A human hair cordage bundle from a desert cache, intimate thread that ties crafts to bodies, considered sacred, handled with ceremony. A dried gourd rattle found near a burial, its voice silenced by respectful storage, its sound remembered by those who requested it not be shaken again. A sheaf of handwritten letters from early collectors reporting Egyptian-style artifacts in the canyon country, followed by replies from the Smithsonian asking for evidence that never arrived. A mass of salt crystallized wood from a Kentucky cave mined for saltpeter, patience stored in crystal, mineral time and human time growing together. Letters, field notes, photographs, paper bones. The transcribed voice of John Wesley Powell, first director of the Bureau of Ethnology, writing to field agents, measure carefully, assume nothing, the letter smells of old paper and river water. A daybook from Cyrus Thomas's Mound Survey, lines of figures building a mountain of data, a monument of numbers raised to stop the fever of myth. A burn-scarred sheaf of early Smithsonian records, what was lost in the 1865 Castle Fire is as suggestive as what survived. A glass plate negative of a burial scene, white hats clustered around a dark hole, embalming the gaze of a century that wanted so much and understood so little. A telegram denying receipt of artifacts named in a newspaper of the same date, the exact fit of absence and claim. A folder marked Nagpur correspondence, full of careful words and long-awaited acknowledgments, signatures that weigh more than stone. Sacred, restricted, and returned, seen only by those who must. A Midwewin birchbark teaching scroll, still a teacher, access governed by elders and spiritual law, its lines and curves a grammar of breath and song. A ceremonial pipe carved generations ago, gifted to the museum in an age when gifts were taken, now listed for repatriation, its stone cool as a promise. A mask that should not be photographed, its presence, not its picture, the meaning, wrapped and still, not dead but resting. A bundle of feathers that never should have left the sky, each barb an idea, each idea a person, awaiting return. A ghost dance shirt, its beadwork like a constellation, its history an open wound, carefully stored, gently consulted, the future its own. A war god figure that never belonged indoors, repatriated and reinstalled in the wilderness of its own home, entry closed forever, as it should be. A string of wampum that is not jewelry but memory, treaty text in bead, readable only in the language of those who made it. A box containing nothing but a letter and a story, a family's account of a strange artifact passed down and lost, the most human thing in any archive, the confession of forgetting. The ledger is part rumor, part record. Many of these objects are not hidden at all. Some are famous and displayed on rotation. Some are private because they are sacred, not because they are seditious. Some never existed beyond ink and wish. And some still defy their labels, like all good things do. Mainstream historical understanding. The Smithsonian was born of a bequest, a gift from a man who never visited America, James Smithson, whose will called for an institution for the increase and diffusion of knowledge. It became a living museum system, and with it, for good and for ill, came the 19th century drive to collect. The Bureau of American Ethnology, under John Wesley Powell, sent field agents across the continent to map, measure, and ask. Their reports included a landmark, the 12th Annual Report, published in 1894, led by Cyrus Thomas, who argued against the then popular myth that North America's mounds had been built by a vanished race separate from indigenous peoples. He marshaled evidence that the ancestors of living native nations raised them, layer by layer, century by century, a conclusion that seems obvious now but was radical in its time. The Smithsonian's physical anthropology collections grew under figures like Alesh Hrdlicka, whose career reminds us that science is done by humans, and humans have blind spots. He resisted claims of deep antiquity for people in the Americas until evidence from sites like Folsom forced timelines open. He was one of a generation who filled cabinets with skulls while filing away the voices attached to them. The institution has, over the past century, contended with that legacy. Today, federal law draws clearer lines. The National Museum of the American Indian Act, 1989, and the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, 1990, require museums to inventory, consult, and return. Sacred and funerary objects are often withheld from display not because they are awkward to the narrative, but because their rightful place is not behind glass. The Smithsonian's Suitland facilities exist to protect fragile items, wet collections, textiles, papers, bones. The ratio is stark, a sliver of holdings can be exhibited at once. The rest simply live in the long cadence of care. As for the giants that newspapers used to headline, every few years, a new storm forms from a century-old clipping. When investigators follow these stories back, they find bones already returned to tribes, measurements corrected by modern standards, newspaper printers paid by the inch, and a public appetite that never changes. Double rows of teeth often turns out to mean nothing more than dental alveoli mistaken for a spare smile, or pathological crowding. Loosed context becomes miracle. Context restored becomes human. Likewise, inscribed stones that promise old world contact, some from Ohio, some from Tennessee, some from the clever hands of modern hoaxers, have been subjected to repeated analysis. The consensus shifts as data does, but at present, the Bat Creek stone likely belongs to an era of enthusiasm for proving the Bible in America rather than to a first-century scribe who lost his way in the Smokies. Such objects remain in collections for the same reason we keep our myths, to measure our desire. And the Grand Canyon Egyptian caves. The Smithsonian has no records of the expedition named in the 1909 Arizona Gazette article, no artifacts, no professor named in their ranks. The most enduring thing from that report is the way the canyon absorbs stories like water into sandstone. Museums are fallible. The Smithsonian has made mistakes, collecting beyond consent, interpreting through narrow lenses, storing people as specimens. But the mainstream record is an evolving ledger. It tells us the mounds were built by native ancestors, that copper was anciently hammered with skill, that trade routes tied ocean shells to prairie fires, that bones overstretched by ink can be shortened by tape and calipers. This is not a conspiracy of silence. It is the relatively dull, deeply necessary work of correction, care, and, sometimes, apology. What doesn't add up? And yet, because every orderly narrative throws its own shadow, questions remain. The 1865 fire that tore through the castle incinerated specimens and records alike. Early shipments from field collectors can be named but not traced, their only memorial a mention in a charred inventory. When a record ends in ash, what sprouts in its place? Sometimes rumor. Sometimes nothing. 19th-century newspapers reported giants with breathless regularity, measured in paces or by how they lay across a coffin lid. People forget how misleading memory is, how flexible an inch is when you are on a deadline, how much editors welcome marvels. But if even one report was grounded in a miscatalogued crate that later vanished into the paper-blind corner of a storeroom, how would we know? Field notes were not standardized. Early measurements varied by method and mood, provenience labels fell off in the rain, bones slipped into boxes with other bones whose lives never met. When our evidence is an old word and a new ruler, the sum depends on who holds both. There are artifacts the Smithsonian will not display at the request of descendant communities. That secrecy is sacred, not suspicious. Still, to the public mind, not for display, and forbidden mean the same thing. The museum says, respect. The public hears, mystery. The institution's size stuns. The numbers, well over 100 million specimens and objects, are beyond imagination. Somewhere between that horizon and our eyes, things will be misplaced, mislabeled, temporarily forgotten. To deny it is folly, to weaponize it is easy. In those shelves and drawers, absence itself becomes an artifact. Some artifacts front-run the interpretive framework, arriving before the questions used to make sense of them exist. They wait. As theories mature, their meanings change. During that waiting, they can look like anomalies. In their patience, they can look like secrets. There are also, always, charlatans and self-deceptions, archives of hoaxes kept not to legitimize the deceit but to inoculate the gullible. Yet hoaxes do damage not only by lying, but by convincing us that every strange thing must be a trick. Somewhere, something true that looks implausible will be thrown out because the frauds taught us a habit of scorn. So it does not quite add up. Not because there is a hidden room filled with the bones of giants, but because between paper and past there's always a gap. In that gap, the 65 keep flickering, and the human mind keeps counting. Anecdotal, tribal, and paranormal layers. Long before curators weighed copper plates by grams, before calibrations and calipers, there were constants, stars, rivers, and stories. The shape of the sky is recorded in Mississippian copper, yes, but also in the words that say the sky is alive and watches. Indigenous nations carry oral histories that hold the same landscapes museums try to map, but from inside them, not from above. The Choctaw have stories of the Naholo, giants who roamed and warred, large not only in height but in appetite, warnings about imbalance put in a human face. Among the Paiute, there are tales of the Ctcah, a people of conflict who wove reeds and fought the ancestors of today's tribes. In Lovelock's cave, archaeologists found sandals, baskets, and bones, some large, most ordinary, the cave echo vibrating with legend whether or not the measurements do. The Cherokee speak of the moon-eyed people, pale and half-blind in the sun, who dwelled in the foothills and stone forts and were driven away, a memory some tie to ancient migrations, others to contact stories or metaphors of the unseen. The Haudenosaunee tell of the Janonsqua, the stone-coated giants, armored beings of hunger who fell to wits and community, a lesson about what happens when hardness replaces heart. The Hopi remember the ant people who sheltered them in worlds beneath worlds when times above became harsh, a geometry of refuge that matches, in a veiled way, the logic of kivas and the layers of layered time. The Ojibwe speak of Wendigo, the starving spirit whose hunger consumes community itself. The warning lives in winter stories, not in bones. These are not data points to be mined for proof of literal giants or lost empires. They are careful containers of teaching. But when an archaeologist opens a mound and finds a skeleton taller than expected, an old tale gives the discovery a face. When a copper plate is lifted and the forked eye turns upward like lightning, a dancer in a story blinks back. The ledger of 65 grows not only from the museum's boxes but from the river of human language, from the way fact and meaning look at each other and neither looks away. Then there are the whispers in the halls. Night watchmen in the Smithsonian castle have told of footsteps in the empty air, of James Smithson seen drifting through his mausoleum, of lights switching on in rooms with no switches, of that particular kind of haunting that institutions know when they house too many human endings and beginnings at once. Are ghosts a byproduct of curation, or simply a word we use for the part of memory that refuses to be shelved? And in the far canyon, the one a newspaper anointed with vaults of mummies and bronze, campers still point to a shadow on a cliff, a doorway shape that looks too regular, too enticing, a shape the geology can make and unmake in a season. The story says the door goes down. The park maps say keep to the trail. The museum says, show me the artifact. The people say, we have always had what you are looking for, and it cannot be taken. Fringe and speculative theories. Fringe ideas rush in where catalogs fear to tread, because they offer a relief from ambiguity, a plot. They explain why the Ledger of 65 feels like a secret, because it is one. In these stories, the Smithsonian becomes a gatekeeper of sacred anomalies, a keeper of forbidden knowledge. That knowledge varies with the teller. Some say the bones of giants do exist, not merely tall men but a lineage of people outsized by purpose, whose bloodline had to be hidden because it contradicts the neat mathematics of our evolution. Some say the inscribed stones are genuine artifacts of Old World pilgrims, Phoenicians, Hebrews, Egyptians, who visited and perhaps settled, leaving alphabets beneath mounds and in river silt, whose traces must be buried because they complicate national narratives. Others dream bigger. The copper plates and mica mirrors were misremembered automata, power conductors from a forgotten age of electricity. The Hopewell's burned mounds are the ashes of machines. The Mississippian plazas were batteries or star computers. The ledger pieces add up to a technology we can no longer parse because we forgot the grammar of ceremony which once held it. In that telling, the Smithsonian is not simply a museum, it is a vault of lost science. There are older, stranger scripts. The ledger's number, 65, becomes a code, a prime factor of a calendar, a key to a geometry found in earthworks, a signature of celestial alignments. The vault pods in Suitland read as hives. The museums on the mall align to a mason's map. The castle's red stone hides, in its shade, a cipher. Knowledge becomes not a field of inquiry but a pattern to be discovered or concealed. A more grounded fringe claims institutional bias, less cloak and dagger, more everyday gatekeeping. It argues that archaeologists, trained within a certain model of the past, inherit pressures to filter anomalies, to flatten extremes into averages, to dismiss data that destabilize comfortable explanations. In this story, the Smithsonian suppresses not overtly but by habit, the slow erosion of outliers by peer review and the gravity of consensus. Against these theories stands the machine of museum, budgets, frozen pipes, conservation textiles, form numbers and humidity charts. It is difficult to imagine clandestine catacombs when you have seen what it takes just to keep pests out of a textile drawer. Yet institutions are human, and humans hold more than one truth at a time. Even if there is no literal vault of forbidden relics, there is another kind, a vault of ideas unasked, because asking them would be inconvenient. Sometimes the fringe is wrong. Sometimes it is playful. Sometimes it wears the face of harm, turning human ancestors into props, ignoring tribal sovereignty, making sacred knowledge into content. And sometimes, it is only the word we use for the strange things that remain after the last box is opened and the last measurement is taken, where respect says, close it again. Emotional, open-ended conclusion. It would be cleaner, perhaps, to put a lock on this story and slide the key into a file marked solved, or disproved, or better, Exhibit A. But the Ledger of 65 was never meant to close. It is the shape of how we look at the past, a circle of light in which we stand, and beyond it, gentle dark. In that dark you can see the raised backs of mounds, at night, like sleeping animals, you can hear rivers counting to themselves, you can imagine a hand lifting a copper plate to catch a star and calling it ceremony, or power, or both. The Smithsonian is not a villain in a cloak, nor a saint in a white coat. It is a living house of memory where mistakes learn to be apologies, where bones learn to become names again, where a drawer can be as holy as a chapel if it is opened with permission. Some things are kept from view because the living ask them to be. Some because fragility is a kind of sacredness. Some because the institution is simply bigger than any single gaze. And some because we do not yet know the right question to ask them. Perhaps the forbidden relics are not artifacts but edges, places where timelines fray and stories overlap. Some edges are in us. Why do we want giants so much? What do we fear or desire that their size would answer? Why do we love an inscription in a known alphabet when we ignore the one our neighbors have been speaking for centuries? Why does a sealed pod in Suitland feel like a secret, when it is a promise to safeguard what was given? Think of a birch bark scroll resting in a room kept at the temperature of winter. Think of a copper plate under muslin clouds. Think of a letter written by a tired field agent who, in a wind that smells of grass and fire, measured the base of a mound by lantern, and wrote the number down with cold fingers. Think of a basket that still holds dust from a day when a child ran and paused and put the basket down. Maybe the ledger of 65 exists because we need it to, not to indict a museum, but to remind us that knowledge is always a negotiation between what can be shown and what must be carried. Between the seen and the said. Between the said and the kept. If there is a vault, it is inside the words we choose. And if there are forbidden relics, perhaps they are forbidden not by policy but by humility, the understanding that some truths are not ours to display, that beauty and power often live best in the care of those who made them, and that the past is not a gallery we stroll through but a family we visit with respect. So we end as we began, in the dark that is not empty. What are we really asking for when we ask to see what is locked away? The comfort of certainty? Or the courage to live with the unresolved? When we peer through the glass into those quiet rooms, are we looking for giants, or for the place in ourselves where we might yet grow? And if you could open any one drawer, knowing it must be shut again, what would you hope to find resting there, waiting for your breath, and how gently would you place it back?